Okay, thanks for coming out today and braving the heat and the elements, as they are. Our program here, you might have heard, one of the things we're doing is making a documentary film about our whole program, and production for that has been provided by the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod and the Cape Cod 5 Cent Savings Bank Charitable Foundation Trust. Also from the Peaked Hill Trust, Glenn and Sheila Mott, the Inn at the Oaks in Eastham, attorney Karen Underhill, and Paul Caloris. Now, the Outermost House, how many of you here have read the book? Okay. How many of you ever saw the house? Okay. How many of you were ever in the house? Okay. All right. And we do get those from time to time. This photograph, actually this sketch, was done by one of Henry Beston's very good friends. His name was Maurice Jake Day, and Jake was a illustrator who did a lot of Henry's early fairy tale books, but he also went on to work for Disney and drew Bambi, among other characters, for Walt Disney, and has the Bambi-ish charm, I guess, in this sketch. The Outermost House, the New York Times referred to it in 1993 as a passionate book about winds, tides, seabirds, and stars, and what it's like to fall in love with a beach. This lovely beach is lovely still. On most foggy afternoons, the beach has not a soul, but Henry Beston's on it. And this is what it looked like without the dust jacket when it first came out in October of 1928. It has never been out of print since. Been through dozens of editions, and it's still one of the top-selling books, along with Henry David Thoreau's Cape Cod over at the National Seashore's Eastern National Bookstore. This is what the cover looks like in the most recent editions, and this photograph was taken by a woman named Nan Turner Waldron, who wrote a book called Journey to Outermost House back in 1991. This was based on her years that she stayed at Beston's Outermost House as a guest of the Audubon Society between 1961 and 1977. She stayed there for a few weeks each year. So she figured by the time she was done with it, she had stayed there as much as Beston had, really. This was her staying at the house during the 1960s, possibly in the 70s. And she is really the cornerstone of the nonprofit organization, her workings of the nonprofit organization, the Henry Beston Society, which I co-founded with my wife Nita in 2002. And we've done all kinds of programs since. Now, as was mentioned earlier, I wrote this book, Henry Beston's Cape Cod, in 2003. This is the new edition of it, which just came out last month. And I have copies of that available here today. We've done a lot of different programs. One of them was with an actor named Marvin Einhorn from New York. He came up to the Cape and performed a one-man performance of Henry Beston and the Outermost House. It's something he put together years ago and got a playwright to do a script for him, but Marvin is probably better known as a director for NBC Nightly News and the Today Show and Mr. Wizard back in the 60s, but also had a love for the Outermost House and did some Broadway as well, or off-Broadway, and eventually also worked his way into some small parts in movies like A Beautiful Mind and A League of Their Own. But Marvin's done this program for us a couple of times. This was up in Provincetown in 2004. These lectures have been all over the place, and especially this year, we've expanded on it quite a bit. This was at the National Seashore 2 years ago, in July, where we had a full house of over 160 people. And this has been presented all across Cape Cod and New England, Eastern Massachusetts. We've been everywhere. I've done dozens of these. I've lost count as to how many there are. I've led walks at the Cape Cod National Seashore on the subject. We've also started to collect quite a few artifacts from the Outermost House. Nan Waldron's family gave us one of the window panes along with bird feeder. And we've also managed to pick up Beston's walking stick and his binoculars and coffee mug. These are all things that he used at the Outermost house. His backpack frame, and his camera, kerosene lamp, and things like that. So we start with Henry Beston. That's to start at the beginning, of course. In June 1st, 1888, Henry was born in Quincy as Henry Beston Sheehan. He was the son of a local doctor, Dr. Joseph Sheehan, who I'm told is one of the founders of Quincy Hospital. His mother was of French Parisian descent, and his brother George Sheehan was also a pretty well-known surgeon in that area. He worked at a Boston hospital with another doctor/writer you might have heard of, Wyman Richardson, who wrote The House on Nauset March. There's little Henry right in the middle, in that little dress he's wearing. And speaking of men in dresses, that's a bunch of guys in this Harvard photo, but Henry's right there in the front. He attended Harvard between, he graduated with a bachelor's in 1909 and then again with a master's in 1911, and went to teach at the University of Lyon in France. Being half French, he was very attracted to that area. And there he is on the left, he's sporting the Charlie Chaplin look. And then when war broke out in Europe, he felt a duty to go out and help however he could. So he joined up with the ambulance service over there and ended up on the front lines. Now, before he got out to the front lines, even, he felt the hard effects of the war. He was speaking with another ambulance driver and a French soldier. And they were talking about, the French soldier wanted to know, the U.S., are they going to get involved with the war? How do they feel about it? And all that kind of stuff. And then just then, a shell came in. And as it hit, they scattered, jumped, went for cover. When Henry got up, the man he had been talking to, the French soldier, was laying there dead with his chest ripped open. So this is what he was exposed to frequently. And he hadn't even gotten to the front lines yet. When he did get to the front lines, he ended up being in the middle of the Battle of Verdun. So you can imagine what he had seen at this point. This was one of the bloodiest battles that had ever been fought, and it went over close to a year. And he was in the middle of the whole thing. So when he came back, he also wrote a book about it called The Volunteer Prelude, under his given name of Henry Sheehan. And he wrote another book too, after being as a servant of the Navy, as a correspondent for the U.S. Navy. He tried to join the Navy when the U.S. got into the war and was turned down because of his astigmatism, but came aboard as a correspondent and was aboard battleships and submarines and things like that, and wrote a book called Full Speed Ahead under the name Henry Sheehan. And he labeled these books as journalism, and he really didn't think much of them. And then he came back, and that's when he really started to realize how much the whole war experience and the governments that caused wars and everything else really started to bother him. So he started writing books of fairy tales. He was looking for that happy ending. And he wrote a couple of good fairy tale books at this point, the Starlight Wonder book and the Firelight Fairy book, one of which he dedicated to his good friend Teddy Roosevelt Jr., young Teddy as he was referred to, a very good friend of his. And he also took a lot of time to travel, and he was about in New Mexico where he became friendly with a Navajo Indian medicine man. And he went about in Europe, very dashing looking guy too. But he also took a job in New York, working for the Living Age magazine, which had just been bought by the Atlantic Monthly. And he was analyzing propaganda coming out of Europe, and he hated this job after a while. He was just, chained to his desk. A treadmill occupation, he called it, and eventually left the job. But before he had taken that job, had left the job, he did get some freelance work. And he found himself out here in Eastham, doing an article called The Warnings of Cape Cod about the Coast Guards for the magazine The World's Work. And he got to go up and down the entire outer beach between all the different Coast Guard stations. Race Point in Provincetown, he was in Truro, Wellfleet at Cahoon's Hollow. I just wrote a story for Provincetown magazine on this subject at the beginning of summer for the July 4th issue. And he really came to greatly admire these men because they were putting their lives on the line. Not like in war where they were putting their lives on the line there too, but this was to save people. This was people in distress up and down the coast in the ships. And the Coast Guards would go out and rescue the people in distress. And they would patrol the beaches up and down, no matter, all day, day and night. And at the beginning of this article, for the world's work, he said, there are 2 Cape Cods in the world. One of the picturesque and familiar land of toy windmills, picnickers, and motorists. The other, the Cape which the sailors see, the Cape of the wild, houseless, outer shore, the countless tragic wrecks, the sandbars, and the shoals. And eventually had a house built down on the dunes here in Eastham, which weren't as tightly regulated. That whole land wasn't really as tightly regulated as it is today. And the name of the house that he had built was called the forecastle, because it was like being aboard a ship looking out over the ocean. And his stationery had the forecastle and not a street address, but just latitude and longitude. And this was an early photograph that he had taken by one of his fellow Coast Guard officers. And beautiful old house that was built atop the dunes there, 20 by 16 with 10 windows. And his water only came from a pump. It's much like the Provincetown dune shacks now. They also have a pump, a lot of them. And it was up on top of the dune overlooking the ocean. And
which beach was it?
Coast Guard, 2 miles south of the Coast Guard station now. And that whole beach now has been reshaped. There used to be really high dunes out there, and it was much longer and wider than it is now. And this is kind of what it looked. This is what it looked like, overlooking the ocean. And I always particularly like this picture of it. It just shows there's only like 20 feet between the house and where it drops off to the high water line. And both his carpenter and the Coast Guards told him, you're too close, you're going to float away one day. But this photograph, I mean, what a great place to have a house. It looks like, the photo looks like something you'd see in the back of the newspaper and the real estate ads. You can imagine, seaside shanty, $3.2 million nowadays. That would probably go for. He got it for a lot less in those days. And he was actually leasing that land when he was staying there. And then in 1932, I think it was, he made the purchase permanent from a local woman. Harvey Moore was the carpenter who built the Outermost house with a crew of about 4 or 5 other people. His great niece, Kate Alpert, is a recent president of the Eastham Historical Society. And Harvey, in his late spring, early summer of 1925, went down the beach with a horse cart full of bricks and wood and all kinds of good stuff to build a house. And within a few weeks, there it was. It was built, and Harvey was warning him, you're too close. But he loved this place, and what a place it was to just shake the war out of his system, or at least find some peace. And that's why he came here, really. He was in search of peace, and he was scarred by the whole thing, and he never really mentioned it, especially in the Outermost house. But here he was looking for that peace of mind, and he could find it, especially just wandering the beach. In beautiful weather like this that we have outside today, or in the nor'easters during the winter, he didn't care. He went out with the patrols, the Coast Guard patrols, loved it, loved the experience. He said it might have been the greatest experience I've ever had on land. And a lot of times he would just sit and meditate on the waves. And that's when you read The Headlong Wave, that's how it comes across, as a meditation. And he said in 1926, and this was even before he had really settled in to stay here, he said, living on the Cape has brought out in me a mystic something that shows surprise of life to be quite the biggest thing. So at that point, he was already being transformed, really. His whole peace, he was looking for peace, and he found it here. His only neighbors were the Coast Guards at the Nauset Station. This is the old one. The one that's out there today at Coast Guard Beach was built in 1936. This was the old station that's there, and that site is now underwater. There was plenty of, I mean, he had a lot of good times out there, but there was also, it was not going to be all pleasant out there. And there were disasters, ship disasters, and this was the worst that he had described with the wreck of the Montclair in 1927, in March of 1927. 5 members of the crew died, and he described it pretty thoroughly in the Outermost house. One that he did not describe in the Outermost house was the Pioneer, a ship that was out at sea in October of 1926, and he witnessed that it was on fire, and the crew had to abandon ship, and the Coast Guards went out and eventually rescued them and brought them ashore, but the wind had driven them south. So they ended up ashore at Henry's house, and they brought them in, and Henry attended to them as best he could. He had medical training, so he was able to help out in that regard. But also, we also got some food together for them, and they were most grateful, especially for the hot wine toddies that he was able to provide. Henry was one of the boys, really, as far as the Coast Guards were concerned. They even gave him his own uniform. And Beverly Plant of East Ham gave me this photograph. She knew Henry as a young child, back in the 1920s. And she also gave me some of these sketches that Henry had provided for their family. He used to always do this. He called it something to amuse the ladies. But this one was, this sketch was Henry walking the beach with his backpack and walking stick to the forecastle, overlooking the beach. And this was another one he wrote to a couple of Beverly Plant's relatives, George and Mary Smith. They were lightkeepers at Highland Light and Truro. And the vegetable stand, of course. Feed him and stuff him groceries, as he called it. Now, the thing is, a lot of people might think that Henry came here, stayed here for a year, and then left. Not the case. It was really stretched out over a couple of years, because the name of the book is The Outermost House, A Year of Life on the Outer Beach of Cape Cod, not A Year of My Life. So it was really, he kind of came and went. But one of the other places he stayed, besides the beach, and particularly in the summer when the greenheads were biting down in Nauset Marsh, he stayed at the Overlook Inn. And this was kind of his home away from home. It's now called Inn at the Oaks. It's located just diagonally across from the seashore entrance. And it's the innkeepers, Tom Kelly and his wife Mary, were kind of, they put him up at the inn, and there's now a room there called, in fact, I'll go back a step. Right up here is the Henry Beston room in the inn. And the Kellys were his taxi service also, going back and forth between, because he had to go into town once a week to get supplies. So he'd go into Orleans. Well, they would pick him up at the Coast Guard station and take him into town, and he'd get his milk and bread and eggs and things like that, and he'd carry them back in his backpack. Well, he had to find a time suitable to do this, so he would signal back and forth to the Kellys. At this time, between the inn and the beach, there were no trees, so you could see from the inn out to the ocean and back out to the bay. So they would go back and forth using Morse code on these lanterns. Well, remember, this was during the era of Prohibition. So a lot of people in town thought, and made for some pretty lively gossip, they thought Henry was a rum runner and was planning his next cargo drop, which was not the case, but he did admit to providing refuge to a rum runner or two during those years. One of his chapters from The Outermost House did make it into print before the book came out in 1928. Night on a Great Beach made it into the Atlantic Monthly. But he hadn't really completed the whole manuscript yet, and I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But he said, of this year, I made a book calling it The Outermost House, the moods of the sky and outer ocean, the tides and rhythms of nature, and the year as one sees them in a great elemental place. What the mind makes of it, musing alone, these are its concerns. And the book had modest sales at first, but it sold well enough, and it kept on going, was never out of print. This is one of the early promotional cards for it, from Doubleday Duran and Company. Henry's writing here, second large printing, at all bookstores, $3 for a hardcover. This is one of the early dust jacket covers for it, and Henry didn't particularly care much for this. He thought it was a little too sinister looking, so it's had quite a few covers since then. Now, Henry the writer, he was very meticulous with his craft, and really not exactly somebody who cranked out the copy, as we like to say in the journalism world. He was often compared, after The Outermost House came out, with another Henry, Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Cape Cod. And, well, Thomas Lyon, who wrote a book called The Incomparable Land, said The Outermost House is a talismanic book of solitude comparable to Thoreau's Walden and Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. And after The Outermost House came out, Henry Beston gave actually a nod to Henry David Thoreau, saying, he referred to himself as the Thoreau Burrow in a letter to his wife, referencing Henry David Thoreau and John Burroughs. But as the years went on, they were always being compared, and Beston started to really tire of this. He really didn't like it. He didn't like the comparisons after a while. I guess because he heard it all the time, but there's a lot of similarities between the two. They both had musical instruments of choice at their spiritual havens. Thoreau had his flute. Beston had a concertina, which he would play sea shanties on and sing with the rolling R. They were both born in the greater Boston area, Thoreau in Concord, Beston in Quincy. They both spent extensive periods of time on Cape Cod and later in Maine and Canada. Neither one used their given names in their work. They both went to Harvard and both were French descent. But as the years went on, Beston finally said, I admire Thoreau, but don't care much for him. He wasn't warm enough. And Beston also used to say Thoreau had no heart about his writing. But it didn't seem to bother Beston too much when he was awarded the Emerson Thoreau Medal by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That had only previously been given to Robert Frost and Beston's Harvard classmate, T.S. Eliot. Beston said, if I tie with anybody, it's with Richard Jefferies. We are both of us scholars with a poetic joy in the visible world. And if you look at Jefferies, what he wrote in The Story of My Heart, you can see where Beston gets a lot of influence. Instinctive worship of sun and earth and sea. The same mystic adoration of the human form as the supreme embodiment of all natural beauty. Henry liked to write at a desk using a number 2 pencil, and would often spend an entire morning on a single sentence. Even if he didn't get it right, he'd crumple it up and throw it over his shoulder, and by the end of the morning, his wife always said, I've known when he's had a bad morning, because there's a big pile on the floor in back of him. So he was a real perfectionist with that. And Beston said that sentences ought to follow each other like waves of the sea and be as individual as waves. A sentence ought to come in at a fair speed, rise, break, and then withdraw, leaving a free space for its successor. And Beston said this in 1926, very shortly after he started staying down here and being influenced by the ocean and the outer beach area. The Outermost House was eventually released in a French edition, which, much to Henry's delight, because he was part French and could speak it and think in French as easily as he did in English. And it translates into, title translates into A House at the End of the World. But Henry read it and he said it sounds even better in French than it does in English. He had a lot of followers afterwards, one of them being Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson said that The Outermost House was the only book to ever influence her writing. And she used to keep a copy of it on her nightstand next to her bed. She said because that's what, it was there to remind her of what good writing was. And she also paid a visit to Beston's house late in her life, and she actually just stood there in several minutes in meditative silence. She actually was a very good friend of Henry Beston and Elizabeth Coatsworth, too, in their later years. Speaking of going to the Outermost house, that's what we'll do right now. Take a look inside and out. Here's what it looked like from the sky, the whole Outer Beach area. And Beston's house this was the last location it was in, tucked away in the little dune here.
It was moved.
Twice. And I'll get to that too. There's the Atlantic Ocean here and Nauset Marsh back here. So pretty thin barrier beach. And this drops down, and these were taken in the 60s and 70s, mostly by Nan Turner Waldron, while she was staying there. And you can see in the background Orleans and Eastham in the back, across the marsh. And back here, there's the Coast Guard station. That's 2 miles to the north. So it kind of gives you an idea. If you go down that beach now, there's the inlet opening that divides the Eastham and Orleans side. But that's really well into Eastham. When you continue on the other side, a lot of the end of that Orleans Nauset Beach is actually in Eastham. And these are just some more of the outside photos that Nan was able to take over the years. So now we've seen the outside of it, let's take a look on the inside, go upstairs. This was a really well-built house. Harvey Moore did a great job putting this house together. Very snug and very solid. And you go inside here, a lot of these other structures on the outer beach, they're just thrown together with anything that floated ashore. This house, really, really solid. And 2 rooms, 1 big main room. It had a fireplace and then later on a wood stove. The second time it was moved, they ended up having to put a wood stove in. A lot more efficient, I imagine. And this was the big main room. There was a living room area. There was a kitchen area. This is probably the window pane that we have, actually. And pump was here. They had a small sink basin. There was no electricity or anything else like that, no telephone or anything else like that. All your lights were coming from candles or from lamps, from kerosene lamps. When Mass Audubon took over the property in the very early 60s, they ended up, they were renting it out to their members, so they started putting cots inside the house to accommodate more people. And Henry always had a lot of books there, and we have some of those now as well. And of course, there was one other thing, a little bedroom in the back. And Henry wouldn't sleep in here during the winter. It was just too cold. And he had to stay out near the fireplace. He said if he didn't do that, he would have froze. And this gives you an idea of how it looked from one of the windows, where you could sit and write. Kerosene lamp and the chair. He had a couple of blue chairs there, and one of them he found on the beach. Brought it back, painted it blue, and he kept it there all those years. When the house was washed away in '78, well, the chair washed ashore again, and they found it, and now it's hanging in Mass Audubon's Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. And they also have a few other items there as well. When you're living on this beach out here, and many of you live here in Eastham or on the Outer Cape? Okay, so you know what it's like being out here, especially in the winter, and you see the storms. If you're on the beach, like where the house was, this is a sunrise photo, but there's the ocean and there's the house. You're not too far away. And when the ocean starts acting like this, you want to get out. You want to get out of Dodge, basically. And that's what Nan Waldron had to do. She was staying here in May of 1977 when a big storm broke out. Actually, I'll go to this storm in 1933 first. This is pretty tight. It's pretty close right here. Before this storm in 1933, there was 20 feet of sand in front of the house. And this is a better angle, I think. It's practically hanging on the edge almost. Henry came down from Hingham. He was notified that his house might be in trouble, and he also could see the storm that was brewing. And came down, and this is what he found. The house, not much space left. And he started taking stuff out because he was really afraid this was going to be it. Well, it survived. And then had it moved back, and then 11 years later, had to be moved again because the dune it was on started hollowing out. So it was moved back closer to the marsh, which didn't really sit too well with his wife. She had said afterwards of this new location, she said what had been the cock of the dune became a pathetic little heath hen with the new location, because you weren't on top of the dune overlooking the ocean anymore. Now you were down close to the marsh. And of course, sand could be a problem when you were living in a place like this. Some of the dune shack folks have told me that even during the winter, as tightly as the place is closed up, there's still sand coming in through the roof or whatever. But flooding was the real issue here when you live down this close to the water. And in 1977, Nan Waldron was down there, and the ocean started acting up, and she thought it was peculiar. And an unforecasted storm hit, and she left. Got out of there real quick, and it was a good thing, because when she came back, she said, I had to wade in water up to almost her shoulders to get back into the house. The house was completely surrounded by water. So it was only a matter of time before the house was going to meet its demise at the hands of the ocean. But, and I'll get back to that shortly. When Beston left here in September of 1927, he said, my year had come full circle, it was time to close my door. Well, he came back up to Quincy and proposed marriage to his longtime girlfriend, Elizabeth Coatsworth, who was a writer of some note herself. And he was pressing the marriage issue, and she wanted to know what was the deal with his book. He said, you've been down there all that time. Aren't you writing a book about it? Well, yeah, I have a lot of I have a lot of notes, but I don't have a manuscript. And he kept pressing the whole marriage issue at that point. And finally, it got to the point where she said, okay, look, no book, no marriage. That was September of 1927. The book was done, the manuscript was done in April of 1928. And quite the motivator. And it ended up being published. The Outermost House came out October of 1928. The Bestons were married in June of 1929. And this was their house in Hingham, where they were living. It was one of the Coatsworth family's houses, actually. And it overlooked Hingham Harbor. And a beautiful house. I've seen it. It's gorgeous. But Henry was not all enthused with living the suburban lifestyle, which was really starting to take over that area at the time. And then his friend Jake Day, the illustrator who did Bambi, told him about this house for sale in Maine, in Nobleboro, Maine, right off of Route 1. It's about 40 miles northeast of Brunswick. And Jake Day owned a houseboat on Damariscotta Lake. And this house overlooks Damariscotta Lake. And he told him about the farmhouse for sale, and Henry loved the idea, and he bought it. This was a place where he could be, just immersed in his surroundings. That's what he had to do. He had to be possessed by his surroundings to write about it. And he had that here in Eastham. And he also had that in Maine as well. And he wrote several books. Even though it took a while before, after the Outermost House came out in 1928, he didn't write another book for 8 years. It didn't come out. He actually had a contract, though, to write another book about the Cape, the inland Cape. And he actually had started writing a couple of chapters. You could have probably called it the Outermost House almost. He was writing about eeling at the salt pond and some of the other, he was trying to find out about some of the life, the natural life around here. And he couldn't do it though. He knew how good the Outermost House was, and he couldn't really bring himself to write another book about it. And it's a shame really, because he was at the height of his creative powers at this point. And when he finally tore it all up, or most of it, and other researchers have told me they've read some of what he wrote, and they said, great stuff, but he didn't want to, you know, smear what he had already done. That's what he was afraid of. That's maybe some advice that maybe some Hollywood movie directors might take when they decide to make a sequel about something. But he didn't write another book for 8 years. It was called Herbs in the Earth, about his herb garden in his attic of his farmhouse in Maine. And he wrote another book called Northern Farm, which was kind of reads like the Outermost Farm almost. And also went up to the St. Lawrence and wrote a book by that name, journeying up and down the St. Lawrence River Valley, and which he was able to do very easily, speaking French like he did. But he never really wrote anything like at the level of the Outermost House ever again. He lived in Maine part-time from 1931 until 1944, and moved there full-time in 44, and lived there the rest of his life with his wife Elizabeth and their 2 children, Meg and Kate. Kate just passed away 2 months ago. Meg died probably 6 or 7 years ago. And Henry, he did have some problems though, finding the place where he could write. He was one that really couldn't be disturbed by family life. He had to concentrate. Elizabeth managed to crank out copy at a very efficient rate, not so much for Henry. He had to really, really work at it. He never struggled with anything except his writing, his wife often said. One of the places that he tried, besides the herb attic there in the house, was a little shack out in the woods. And that didn't work out too well either, but they finally went back into this house a few years ago, a couple of organizations in Maine that are helping to take care of the old farmhouse there now. And they went in the house and they found this old shack and found it as Henry had left it in the 1950s. And they found old notes and everything there, plus a lot of yellow jackets and mice and all kinds of other undesirable things. But they ended up renovating this shack, and it's a beautiful little place now, down in the back towards the lake. And the house itself is beautiful, and it's still being preserved. They've sold it off in conservation easements, and they're preserving that area. They want to do stuff with writers and things like that. And it's just a gorgeous place. The Bestons lived there until Henry died in 1968. He suffered a couple of small strokes in the 50s, and he really couldn't get around very well in his later years. He had to use a walker and then eventually a wheelchair. And he died in 1968, just before his 80th birthday. But before that happened, they held a special ceremony for him here in Eastham. And at that ceremony on October 11th, 1964, they dedicated Beston's house as a national literary landmark, and said that one of the reasons, the Outermost House was one of the reasons that the Cape Cod National Seashore exists today. Those aren't my words, those were the words of the Governor Endicott Peabody of Massachusetts. And there were a lot of other people at this ceremony too. There was also representatives from the Department of the Interior. They were here representing Stuart Udall. And at this ceremony, it was held down in front of the Coast Guard station. And back then they had a big bathhouse and an amphitheater and everything else in the front there. And there were anywhere from 200 to 2,000 people there. It depends on who you ask, but it was in the neighborhood of 1,000 people. And Beston, they paid tribute to him there, honoring him for what he had done. And not only did the governor say what he did about it being one of the reasons that the seashore existed, but also George Palmer, who represented the Department of the Interior, and Stuart Udall said that back in the 1950s, when they evaluated this area, the Park Service came in here and evaluated the area to see whether it was suitable and what they could do to make it a national park. They ended up quoting Henry Beston's Outermost House on several occasions. The first one they used was Outermost Cliff and Solitary Dune. This is Eastham, this is the Outer Cape. That was one of them that they used, and Palmer pointed that out, and he ended up pointing out about half a dozen more throughout the whole program. So it was all over the reports before they even sent it into Congress. And this is Beston with Governor Peabody, and Beston read from his book, from the Outermost House, the last couple of paragraphs at the end of the ceremony. And he was in bad shape, and his voice was really weak. And his wife was worried they weren't going to be able to hear him during it. And the guy who was doing the sound said, "Don't worry about it. When I get through, they're going to hear him over in Portugal." And everybody heard him just fine. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house from everybody that's been there, what they said. Dozens of people were weeping. They knew the Cape and they cared, is what Ivan Sandroff of the Worcester Telegram wrote. Sandroff was one of the organizers of that event, along with Tony Peabody, the governor's wife. The Cape Cod Times was there covering it, as was the Cape Codder, and a lot of other newspapers from near and far. And the Cape Codder said it was Henry Beston Day in Eastham, and everyone was there, including Tony Peabody and everybody else. They went down to the house after the ceremony, and the Bestons were in the buggies. And one of the rangers who drove them down told me how Beston was using less than pleasant language to describe the greenhead flies. But they got down there, and Beston drank from his pump one last time. It was the last time he ever saw the house. And people were lining up outside. They walked down the beach and lined up to get a look at the house where Henry had stayed. They gave Henry this plaque, this special plaque telling how it was a National Literary Landmark. That's the one they gave him. This is the one that was put on the side of the house following the ceremony. Now, Beston died in 1968. Almost 10 years later, the house met its fate. Now, February 6th and 7th, how many of you were in the Boston area? Okay, digging out, no doubt. Okay, how many of you were here on the Cape? Okay, not as much snow, but it was still an adventure nevertheless. How many of you here had to dig out from that storm one way or another? Okay, you do remember it. It was brutal, and I was in New Jersey, and even there it was brutal. But by the time it got up here, it was a monster. It was this is the storm that every other one is measured by. You know why meteorologists go crazy when a snowstorm is coming? It's because of that one. They all think it's going to be the next 1978 when they talk about any kind of a snowfall. This was taken February 5th, 1978. Karen McLean sent me this photo 10 years ago. And she and her husband walked down the beach that day and got this photo, and it's probably the last one ever taken of the house because the next day was when the storm hit, and they had gotten off the Cape by that time. So weren't here for the storm. This is what the outer beach, well, Coast Guard beach looked like before the storm. Now you can see a lot of other cottages had popped up here, all over the place. It wasn't just Beston's house, which was way, way down here somewhere. A lot of other people had houses here as well, as Conrad Nobley of Eastham, who I did a program with in this very building 7 years ago. And Conrad had his own house there. It was called the Butterfly House, and it was an architectural wonder. Beautiful house. And he was kind of a neighbor to the Outermost house, and his house is in there somewhere as well. This is the parking lot and the bathhouse that was down on the beach beforehand. That's gone now because of this storm. This was the forecast for February 6, 1978. Snow heavy at times, 8 to 16 inches. 25 to 40 mile an hour winds. This is pretty typical stuff for New England nor'easters. Anytime a storm is ready to come in. That's what they're saying. Well, this is what happened. At high tide at new moon on that day, 14.5 feet above mean low water. That's 4 feet above normal. The level of the ocean was just so incredibly high that day. Not to mention the waves, but also just the level of it was amazing. The high winds were officially at 92 miles an hour. Unofficially, they said it was 120 before the wind gauge gave out at the Chatham Coast Guard Station. The bathhouse and the parking lot were completely destroyed, and a 50-foot-long concrete septic tank was unearthed down there near the bathhouse area. Now, allow me to play TV meteorologist for a minute. This is the satellite photo from that storm. And here is Cape Cod, and here's Eastern Mass. Now, this storm developed an eye. It was actually a winter hurricane. So when it hit, it was sending these bands of snow all across Boston and the South Shore, but here on Cape Cod, they were in the clear. They were in the eye for at least a couple of hours. So while this area is getting pounded with all the snow, down here on the Cape, where it had already turned to rain the night before, they were sitting out at the beach watching the ocean. They were out there watching. The sun was out. People were bringing picnics down there, and thousands of people came down to the beach to see what the ocean was doing, because this is what it was doing. It overran the entire barrier beach and took a lot of the houses with it, and of course the bathhouse. Noel Bile, who's a historian here in town, Noel told me he went down there that day. Somebody told him what was going on, and he went down there and took a lot of pictures of this. And that might be Noel right there, for all I know. He said that he went through 17 rolls of film taking photographs of this whole thing. And this is what the whole barrier beach looked like afterwards. There was still a break in it a week later. And of course, it swept away a lot of the houses that were there. This is one of the other houses that was on the Livermore Cottage, actually, is what it was. And this was Beston's house. Jack Clark, who was a ranger at the seashore back in '78, told me he was up at the top of the Coast Guard station, and he saw the outermost house being lifted off of its foundation and carried away, and it floated into the marsh. It was actually just kind of bobbing around for a while, and then the waves got it and broke it up along with all the other houses. And fragments of it ended up at Fort Hill. Some of it ended up in Orleans. A lot of it was at Fort Hill, though. And this was Wallace Bailey from the Audubon Society picking up a piece of it, and there was the dedication plaque on the side. And Mass Audubon retained that. They ended up having to scrap a lot of these pieces, though, because it was a hazard. So they really couldn't hang on to a lot of it, although pieces of it are around, and we have some of it.
Why was it a hazard?
Because there were nails sticking out and things like that, and really was, splintered wood. Handling it or going near it would have been dangerous. This is a before and after photo that was put together. Before the storm and after the storm. All that was left was just flattened sand and some posts. It's pretty amazing that it went from that to that, just in one storm. Nan Waldron was living in Sharon, not too far outside of Boston, and came down a week later after the roads were open. And this is what she found. She found pieces of the floor and a lot of other things too, parts of the pump. And she wasn't able to carry back a lot of it, but she did carry back the window pane and the bird feeder. Actually, her friend went down and picked up the bird feeder before the storm. Mass Audubon sent this out 2 days later, this letter to its membership saying the outermost house is gone. And he quoted the outermost house from the midwinter chapter where they described such a storm, telling the membership that it was gone and they weren't going to rebuild it. 1925, this is how the beach looked. Over here on the right is how it looks today. So here's where the house was located on the barrier beach. Up here is where the Coast Guard station is, or was. And then over here, you've got a break now in the beach. The house, same location, is now out at sea. So it's, people have asked rangers too, how do I get to where the outermost house was? Well, yeah, exactly. Go to the end of Coast Guard Beach and then walk some more. That's where you'll find it. I'll tell you a little bit about our documentary film project, which is there's presentations and my book, but the project is based on all of what we've done so far, and we'll tell this same story in documentary film form. And it's not something we're throwing together. We have someone on it who is very qualified. His name is Christopher Seifert. He is a movie maker from Chatham, has a company called Mooncusser Films, and he's worked with the likes of Walter Cronkite and Julie Harris on documentary films about the Cape. And Chris has stressed that we need to, in addition to all the historic information, and a lot of it which we've shown you here today, you also have to have really good, solid, high definition nature footage. So it's kind of like making a historic document, but it's like making a nature documentary, because this is what you want to try to present the same kind of picture that Beston saw. And he marveled in the splendor and the beauty. And that's what we need to do, is try to present that as accurately as possible. Here he's showing me at a cabin that he rented in Wellfleet that looks a lot like the Outermost house. He was showing me some of the sunrise footage that he got that day on his computer. And yeah, we also have an actor to play Beston in the reenactment scenes. His name is Chris Kolb. He's from the Cape. He lives in Sandwich. And we were looking for people to play the part, and Chris Seifert told me, hey, I know a guy who works with me sometimes. He could pass for him, after he looked at all the pictures of Beston. And Chris has fit the part very nicely. And we were out here in Wellfleet. We were very lucky that day. There's our outermost house looking cottage. But also that day there was a huge fog bank over the whole area, which was great. It really added to it. Earlier this summer, actually late in the spring, Chris Seifert secured a 2-week residency through the Peaked Hill Trust at the Ray Wells Dune Shack in Provincetown. So he shot all kinds of footage out there, and we couldn't ask for better surroundings for that. This was at night, right before we were ready to, Chris Kolb and I were ready to go, but most of the light in here is from the flash, from the camera. Otherwise it was pretty dark. But this is some of the, just some of the footage that we were able to shoot out there. And here's you've got the whole splendor of what the dunes look like out here. And Chris is shooting some footage here. And there's the dune shack. And we were able to get some really nice shots, reenactment scenes. Chris Seifert also went up in the plane, got some great shots of the outer beach, and especially Beston's beach right here. This is the opening to the end. This is the inlet opening to the marsh. Beston's house's site is probably out here somewhere. And yeah, we even went out on the nor'easters like Beston did. This was in early November at Nauset Beach in Orleans. I was the poor soul who had to hold up the umbrella against the wind, so our director could shoot footage. So I'm holding this thing against a 40-mile-an-hour gale. This was quite a physical workout, to say the least. But we somehow got it done. I was kind of sore for a couple of days after that, but we got through it all right. And the elements were very good to us once again. It unearthed the remains of the wreck of the Montclair, which was documented in the Outermost house. And Beston used to find skeletons of shipwrecks on the beach all the time, so that added to it. This was a few years ago, and yes, that is me on the right. We have interviewed Dr. Daniel Payne, who is just completing a biography about Beston, and is quite the treasure trove of information. We also interviewed Bill Burke from the Cape Cod National Seashore, the historian, and Joan Anderson, a local author, New York Times bestseller, and Jonathan Moore, who was a legislative assistant to Senator Leverett Saltonstall during the Cape Cod National Seashore legislative years before it was actually passed and signed into law. Jonathan has a lot of great insight to the whole process, and also was a big believer in how much the Outermost house influenced the entire process, and he used to mention it in making his point in getting the legislation across to people. And this was the day that it was signed into law, and August 7th, 1961, we recognized the gentleman seated at the desk there in the Oval Office, John F. Kennedy. That's Jonathan Moore on the left, overlooking the whole thing. So I invite you to visit our website at henrybeston.org. Now I will show you some footage.
I went there to spend a fortnight in September. The fortnight ending, I lingered on, and as the year lengthened into autumn, the beauty and mystery of this earth and outer sea so possessed and held me that I could not go. The longer I stayed, the more eager I was to know this coast and to share its mysterious and elemental life. I made up my mind to remain and try living for a year on East Ham Beach.
As Henry comes out to the Cape and starts reveling in nature, in part as a way of recovering from his wartime experiences, he volunteered to help as an ambulance driver in the Great War, the front at Verdun. He really was looking for something that would indicate that all was not lost. I mean, this is the era of the lost generation. When he goes to the Cape, one of the great lessons that he learns, or perhaps relearns from his experience there, is that nature has a healing power.
Sun and moon rise here from the sea. The arched sky has an ocean vastness. The clouds are now of ocean, now of earth. Having known and loved this land for many years, it came about and I found myself free to visit there. And so I built myself a house upon the beach. The ocean besieged my door. North and north alone, I had touch with human beings. On its solitary dune, my house faced the four walls of the world.
You know, there's so much that feeds you about the outer bar. There's so much that must have fed Henry. The smell of the salt in the wood of his house. There'd be no other smell like that. And you burn it at night and it's just delicious. And all of those things he lived with during that year, they call you back. They call you home. He was called home here.
He created such a beautiful piece of writing that many people's hearts responded to it. Like John Muir making a case for Yosemite. He certainly made the first impassioned written case for that place to be saved on its own merit. I mean, he just really recognized that it was really special. So Henry comes back and he goes and lives out on Cape Cod and gets as far away as he can from humans for a while, but gets into the natural world and finds solace and healing and great beauty in the natural world. His daughter Kate said he always strove to write an even better book than Outermost House, but it never really happened.
As one stands on the shore looking out, he is able to realize that creation is still going on. The creative forces are as great and as active today as they have ever been. And tomorrow's morning will be as heroic as any in the world.
thank you for coming out in the heat.